I shouldn't have opened the door wearing nothing but a silk robe. But I did. The air was thick with humidity, the kind that clings to your skin and makes your clothes feel like an unnecessary layer. I had been lounging all morning, the summer heat making me lazy, making me restless. My husband, Darren, was away on another work trip. 3 days in Dallas, meetings and dinners, the usual. I should have been used to it by now, the long stretches of time alone in this house that was too big for just the two of us. But some days, the loneliness felt like a slow burn, creeping under my skin, turning into something else entirely. And then the doorbell rang. I knew it was the repairman. Darren had called him days ago to fix the AC unit that had been rattling for weeks. I had almost forgotten about it, caught up in my own world, drowning in boredom. But as I walked to the door, the thin silk brushing against my bare skin, something in me shifted. I felt the anticipation curl low in my stomach before I even turned the knob. He stood there, tool bag in hand, sweat glistening on his arms from the brutal heat. Tall, broad shoulders, sun-kissed skin. His name was Evan. I had seen him before, once or twice, when Darren was home. He had always been polite, professional, never lingering longer than necessary. But now, standing there with nothing between us but the summer air and the faint hum of cicadas, I saw him differently. And judging by the way his gaze flicked down, just for a second, before meeting my eyes again, I knew he saw me differently too. "Ma'am," he greeted, voice deep, steady. "Here to fix that AC." "Right," I murmured, stepping aside to let him in. "Come on in. It's unbearable in here." I turned on my heel, walking ahead of him, knowing full well how the robe clung to my frame, how it barely reached mid-thigh. I felt his presence behind me, solid and quiet, as he shut the door. I could hear the way he shifted, adjusting his tool bag, probably forcing himself to focus on the job. I liked that. I liked that I was making it hard for him. "Unit's upstairs," I said, leading him toward the staircase. "It's been making this awful noise." "I'll take a look." I walked slowly, each step deliberate, my body humming with an energy I hadn't felt in a long time. Not with Darren, not in years. There was something about Evan, the way he moved, the way he carried himself, that made my skin prickle with awareness. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't one of those men who strutted around like they knew they could have anyone they wanted. No, he was quiet strength, unassuming confidence. And that was far more dangerous. He set his bag down by the AC unit, crouching as he unzipped it. I watched from the doorway, leaning against the frame, arms crossed just enough to make the fabric slip down my shoulder. His eyes flicked up, just for a second, before he turned back to his tools. "Been running it a lot?" he asked, his voice a little lower this time. "Yeah, nights are the worst. It gets so hot in here." I saw the way his fingers tightened around the wrench before he forced himself to focus. I liked that too. I stepped inside the room, circling to the window, pretending to fuss with the curtain. I knew what I was doing, and I knew it was wrong, but that didn't stop me. "How long have you been doing this?" I asked, my back to him now. "Repair work? A few years. Before that, construction." "Ah, that explains it." "Explains what?" I turned, leaning back against the windowsill. "The arms." That did it. His hands stilled for a fraction of a second before he went back to work. "Guess it comes with the job." I bet." A slow, quiet tension filled the space between us, stretching thin, waiting to snap. I could feel it, the pull, the inevitability of it all. And yet, neither of us made the first move. Not yet. "Shouldn't take too long," he said after a moment. "Just needs a few adjustments." "Take your time. I don't mind the company." His jaw tightened, just a little. I wondered what he was thinking, if he was cursing himself for the thoughts running through his head, the way I was, if he was wondering how much longer he could keep himself in check. The idea of it sent a shiver through me. I turned back toward the window, giving him space, giving myself a moment to breathe. But it didn't help. Nothing could have prepared me for what happened next, because the second I turned, I caught our reflection in the glass, and what I saw nearly made me gasp. Evan standing behind me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating from his body. He hadn't touched me, not yet, but the way he was looking at me, it was as if he already had, and that was just the beginning. His breath was steady, but I could feel the weight of it against my skin, the heat radiating from his body, even though he hadn't touched me. Yet, I knew I should move, say something, break the moment before it spiraled beyond control. But I didn't. I couldn't. The hum of the AC unit was the only sound filling the room, but the silence between us was deafening. I saw his hands clench, then relax, as if he was forcing himself to stay professional, to keep this about the job. But I had already ruined that, hadn't I? I had opened the door like this, let the silk robe slip just enough, watched the way his eyes flickered with something dark and restrained. I turned around slowly, my back now pressed against the window, my gaze locked onto his. His eyes, a shade of blue that reminded me of the ocean on stormy days, held mine with an intensity that made my stomach tighten. He was waiting for me to be the one to push the boundary further, and I wanted to. "You're sweating," I murmured, my voice softer than I expected. He swallowed hard, but he didn't move away. "It's hot in here. Maybe you should take your shirt off. Might make it easier to work." The way his jaw clenched told me he knew exactly what I was doing, but he didn't call me out on it. Instead, he reached back and pulled his shirt over his head in one smooth motion, revealing a body that could have been carved from stone. My eyes traced the muscles in his arms, his chest, his stomach. A part of me knew I was playing with fire, but I had never been one to back away from heat. "Better?" he asked, his voice lower now. "Much." He exhaled sharply, shaking his head slightly, like he was trying to clear his thoughts. He turned back to the unit, working his hands over the wires and bolts, trying to focus. I watched him, the way his back muscles tensed with every movement, the way his fingers flexed and tightened as he adjusted something inside the machine. "Your husband's not home?" he asked suddenly, his tone careful. "No, he's away on business." He nodded but said nothing, though I could see the way his hands hesitated for just a fraction of a second before continuing. "You must get a lot of these calls," I said, my voice light. "Women, home alone, something needing fixing." He let out a short breath of laughter, shaking his head. "Not like this." I tilted my head. "Like what?" He hesitated, then turned slightly, just enough to look at me again. "Like you." My heart pounded, a slow, steady beat that echoed through my whole body. I should have been satisfied with that response, should have let it sit between us and kept this moment exactly where it was, charged, unspoken, nothing but possibility. But that wasn't enough for me. I took a step closer, and he stilled completely. "What about me?" His jaw tightened. "You know." "Maybe, but I like to hear things said out loud." He exhaled, long and slow. His hands gripped the edge of the unit, knuckles white. I could see the internal battle written all over his face, the way his body was caught between restraint and desire. And then, finally, he turned fully to face me. "You make it impossible to focus," he admitted, his voice almost a growl. "From the second I walked in, you knew exactly what you were doing." A thrill shot through me, sharp and electric. I closed the remaining space between us, standing so close I could feel the heat rolling off his skin. I reached out slowly, dragging my fingers over his forearm. His body tensed beneath my touch, but he didn't pull away. Then stopped trying to fight it. His breath hitched, his eyes darkening. "You're married. And you came here to fix something that was broken." He let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "That what you think this is?" I ran my fingers higher, tracing the curve of his bicep. "I think I've been waiting for something like this for a long time." Something inside him snapped. 1 second he was standing rigid, holding himself back. The next his hands were on me, gripping my waist, pulling me against him. I gasped at the suddenness of it, at the way his fingers dug into my hips like he had been dying to touch me but hadn't allowed himself to. "You shouldn't be doing this," he murmured against my ear, his breath hot against my skin. "But you don't want me to stop." He let out a sound, something between a groan and a curse, before tilting his head down, his lips just barely grazing my neck. My whole body shuddered, every nerve ending coming alive at once. My fingers trailed up his chest, feeling the way his heart pounded just as fast as mine. He was holding back. Even now, even with his hands gripping me, his body pressed against mine, he was still trying to be the responsible one, but I had already made up my mind. I leaned in, my lips hovering over his. "Tell me to stop." He didn't. Instead, he kissed me, hard and desperate, like he had lost the battle he had been fighting since the moment he walked through that door. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Not my husband, not the consequences, just the heat, the urgency, the way his hands roamed over my body like he had been starving for this. I didn't care what happened next. I just knew I wasn't stopping. Not now. The air was thick, charged with something electric and dangerous. My body was humming, every nerve alert, my skin still tingling from the way his hands had roamed over me. Evan pulled back, his breath ragged, eyes dark with something I had only seen glimpses of before. He was holding back, still trying to be the good man, still trying to fight what was already inevitable. I reached up, fingers grazing his jaw. "You're thinking too much." He let out a low chuckle, but it was rough, strained. "I should be." "But you're not." His hands tightened on my waist, his fingers pressing into my skin like he was grounding himself. "You don't make it easy." "Good." A muscle in his jaw jumped, his self-control hanging by a thread, and I wanted to snap it. He had already kissed me, already let his hands linger where they shouldn't. There was no taking that back, no undoing what had already started. The air between us was thick, buzzing with anticipation, and I could feel the pull, an undeniable force drawing us closer. I moved first, tilting my chin up, letting my lips brush against his. He inhaled sharply, his grip tightening as if he was trying to anchor himself. But I wasn't letting him hesitate any longer. I pressed closer, my body molding against his, feeling the hard lines of him against the soft curves of me. Evan groaned low in his throat, and then he was kissing me again. Harder this time, with all the restraint gone. His hands slid up my back, pulling me flush against him, and I felt the heat of his skin, the strength of him. My own hands moved greedily, sliding up the ridges of his stomach, over his chest, feeling the way his muscles tensed beneath my touch. "Tell me to stop," he murmured against my lips. I knew he wanted me to say it, to give him an out, but I wasn't going to. I didn't want him to stop. I wanted this, every bit of it. Instead, I pulled him closer. "I won't." Something in him snapped. 1 second he was hesitating, the next he was lifting me, gripping my thighs as he carried me across the room. My back hit the wall, and his lips were everywhere. My neck, my collarbone, the curve of my shoulder. I tilted my head back, breathless, lost in the sensation of his mouth on me, his hands gripping, exploring. He wasn't careful anymore. There was nothing gentle about the way he touched me, nothing cautious about the way his lips claimed mine. This wasn't something slow and sweet. This was hunger, desperate and raw. "You have no idea how long I've wanted this," he muttered against my skin. I shivered, my fingers digging into his shoulders. "Then don't stop." He let out a sound, low and guttural, and then he was lifting me again, carrying me across the room. My heart pounded as he set me down, his hands never leaving me, his touch growing more urgent. My head was spinning, every sense heightened. I knew this was dangerous, knew that if I let this go any further, there would be no coming back. But in that moment, I didn't care. I wanted this. I wanted him. I tangled my fingers in his hair, pulling him back to my lips, and he groaned into my mouth. "You're playing with fire." I smirked, breathless. "I like the heat." His hand skimmed down my sides, sending a fresh wave of shivers through me. He was taking his time now, exploring, memorizing, and I let him, reveling in the way his touch set me ablaze. "You're going to be the death of me," he muttered, pressing his forehead against mine. I smiled, trailing my fingers down his chest. What a way to go. He let out a short, breathy laugh before capturing my lips again, and this time, there was nothing left to hold us back. The aftermath of what had just happened still clung to the air, thick and intoxicating, but I knew better than to let myself get lost in it. Evan had pulled away, just slightly, enough for me to see the war raging behind his eyes. He was trying to catch his breath, to make sense of what we had done, but I wasn't giving him the space to do that. I didn't want to. I reached for him again, my fingers trailing over the defined ridges of his stomach, feeling the way his muscles tensed beneath my touch. His jaw clenched, his hands gripping my hips like he was still fighting against himself, still trying to be the one with the control. "You keep looking at me like that," I whispered, "but you haven't pushed me away yet." He exhaled sharply, his grip tightening, like he was at war with whatever sense of morality he had left. But that moral compass had already been shattered the moment he let his lips touch mine, the moment his hands wandered where they shouldn't have. "This is dangerous," he muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. "You know that." I smirked, letting my nails graze lightly over his skin, watching as his breathing grew uneven. "Then why does it feel so good?" He groaned, his head tilting back just slightly, like he was trying to keep himself from losing control again. But it was too late. We had already crossed that line, and there was no turning back now. I could see it in the way he looked at me, the way his fingers dug into my skin like he wanted more but was still trying to fight against it. "Tell me to stop," he said, voice hoarse. "If you tell me to stop, I will." I met his gaze, my lips curving into a slow smile. "I won't." That was all it took. His restraint snapped like a thread pulled too tight, and suddenly, his hands were in my hair, his lips on mine again, hungrier this time, desperate. He pressed me against the nearest wall, his body solid and unyielding against mine, and I felt the heat return, stronger than before. "You're going to drive me crazy," he murmured against my lips. I grinned, my fingers slipping around his neck, pulling him closer. "Then let me." He made a sound, something between a growl and a groan, before his hand slid lower, gripping my waist like he needed to hold on to something solid. I arched into him, my body already on fire from the way he touched me, the way he looked at me like he wanted to devour me whole. "You don't know what you're doing to me," he muttered, his breath hot against my skin. "Oh, I think I do." His fingers dug in just a little harder, his self-control hanging by a thread. "You're playing a dangerous game." I smiled, leaning up until my lips were just inches from his. "And yet, you're still here." He let out a low breath, like he knew there was no way to walk away from this anymore, like he had given up on the idea of stopping. And then he kissed me again, deeper this time, and I knew we were past the point of no return. We had already gone too far. But neither of us cared anymore. The days after felt like walking a tightrope, balanced between exhilaration and the gnawing weight of reality. Evan was gone before the morning sun had fully settled in the sky, leaving nothing behind but the lingering scent of him on my sheets and the phantom press of his touch on my skin. I had laid there for hours after, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment, every whispered breath, every lingering touch. I knew it should have felt wrong. I knew I should have been drowning in guilt, suffocating under the weight of what I had done. But the truth was, I felt more alive than I had in years. Darren came home that evening, suit crisp, tie slightly loosened, his usual practice smile in place as he stepped through the door. "You look nice," he said, his voice casual, eyes scanning me briefly before moving to set down his suitcase. I had made an effort, hair done, dress fitted, a subtle perfume that clung to my skin. It wasn't for him, though. It was because, for the first time in a long time, I wanted to feel desirable, and Evan had reminded me that I was. "How was Dallas?" I asked, pouring him a drink. "Same as always. Meetings, late dinners, a few rounds of golf with the usual crowd." He loosened his tie further, taking a long sip from the glass. "Anything interesting happen here?" I hesitated, only for a second. Not really, just the AC getting fixed. He barely looked up. Oh yeah? Did it finally stop making that awful noise? I swallowed. The memory of Evan's hands, his mouth, the way he had made me forget everything, flashing through my mind in an instant. I forced a smile. Yeah, it's working perfectly now. Darren nodded, already distracted, pulling his phone from his pocket, scrolling through emails, his focus elsewhere. And just like that, he was gone again. Physically present but emotionally distant. Days passed, and the thrill began to morph into something else entirely. At first, it was a slow, creeping unease, a whisper in the back of my mind, reminding me of the dangerous path I had stepped onto. But then, the text started. At first, I thought I imagined it. A simple message, late at night. Couldn't stop thinking about you. My pulse kicked up, fingers hovering over the screen. I shouldn't have replied, I knew that, but knowing and doing were two very different things. Me neither. And just like that, the line between past and present blurred, turning into something even more complicated. Evan was a temptation I couldn't resist, an itch I kept scratching despite knowing it would only make the wound deeper. He would come by when Darren was away, his presence filling the house with an energy that had long been absent. You're playing with fire, he murmured one afternoon, his hands sliding up my sides, his mouth trailing dangerously close to my ear. Then burn with me. And he did, again and again, until we both forgot what it was like not to. But fire doesn't burn forever without consequences. I should have known it wouldn't stay a secret. Secrets have a way of unraveling when you least expect it. I wasn't sure when Darren first started noticing the changes, the way I pulled away at night, the sudden moments of distraction, the way my phone never left my side. Maybe it was the way my body had reawakened, craving something he hadn't given me in years. Or maybe it was just bad luck. It happened on a Sunday. Darren's flight had been delayed, keeping him home an extra night. I had let my guard down, assuming he was halfway to Chicago, when the knock came at the door. My stomach twisted the moment I opened it. Evan. You shouldn't be here, I whispered, heart pounding as I glanced behind me, half expecting Darren to appear from the hallway. You didn't answer my text, Evan said, his voice low, eyes searching mine. I just needed to see you. I swallowed hard. Not now. But it was already too late. Darren's voice came from behind me, sharp, questioning. Who is it? I turned, stomach plummeting as Darren came into view, his brow furrowing as his gaze shifted from me to Evan. Who's this? Darren asked, his tone laced with suspicion. My mouth opened, searching for an excuse, a lie that wouldn't come. But it was Evan who spoke first. Just came to check on the AC again, he said smoothly, though his eyes betrayed the tension coiling between us. Wanted to make sure everything was running properly. Darren glanced at me, something flickering in his eyes, something wary. Didn't realize we needed another visit. I forced a tight smile. I thought I heard something off again. Darren held Evan's gaze for a beat too long before nodding slightly. Appreciate the thoroughness. Evan nodded, his expression unreadable. Just doing my job. And then he was gone. But I knew, as I shut the door, that something had shifted. Darren's eyes lingered on me, studying me in a way he hadn't in years. He knew something was off. He just didn't know what. Yet. That night, I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, my body still burning from Evan's touch, my mind racing with the weight of what I had done. I thought I had everything under control, but control was never mine to have.